Welcome, all you wiretappers. Glad to be back here in studio of Gangland Wire. I've got one of our good friends who's been on the show many times from New York City, Jeffrey Sussman. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Glad to be here, Gary. It's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, I sure wish we could have met up when I was in New York that time. That would have been fun.
It
Every
would
once
have
in a while
been.
I'll meet somebody I only know through the camera here. It's always a lot of fun.
Well, I hope you come to New York again soon.
I'll let you know. I'll give you a little more advance warning that the next time. I didn't tell you anything till I was there, almost getting ready to go or something. But anyhow,
Right.
you have a new book. You have several books out there, and we've talked about several of them. Of note, I just had a guy on my Facebook page post something about. He posted a picture of your book, Boxing in the Mob, and talked about that book. And so I commented on there, hey, here's an interview with the author. And somebody else said, yeah, he said, that's how I found the book. So, so it does work. We sell a
That's
few
wonderful.
books.
I'm glad to know that. I'm going to have to
It,
make you my agent, Gary.
yeah, really. I need to get a piece of this action here, man.
That's right. You have 10% coming to you.
And don't hold out on me, man.
No, I won't. I'll be very generous.
I'll have to send Guido from the North End here up to see you. Anyhow, he has a new book, Tinseltown Gangsters. There it is, guys, and I'll have links to it, and I'll have links to his author's page because he's got several. You've got one about, and I can't remember the titles. If you can remember them, why don't you recite them off to the guys? You got so many. You're pretty prolific.
Well, the books that I've written about organized crime were Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York, Sin City Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Las Vegas, Boxing in the Mob, and now this new one, Tinseltown Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Hollywood.
Cool. So this is the one we want to talk about, the rise and decline of the mob in Hollywood. And it's really an interesting story because they kind of had a small, I think the word is nascent, but we won't use that word, a small beginner kind of a mob out there. The Dragna family was kind of in control, but it was really just like Las Vegas. It was pretty wide open for the Eastern mobs to come out and do something. And so they moved out, and Bugsy Siegel was one of the first guys that we really know about that moved out, which, the decline of Bugsy Siegel just led to a whole different group of mobsters coming out from Chicago. And it just, that was a pivotal moment, I would say. So Jeffrey, let's talk a little bit. What did you learn about kind of the decline of Bugsy Siegel? We know he was a New York mobster that came out and to put a casino in Las Vegas. So go ahead.
Well, he was originally sent out to control the racing wire that all the bookies had to subscribe to. But then he got more and more involved in Hollywood. He liked the whole Hollywood scene. And he had been a boyhood friend of George Raft, the actor, who had been a protege of the gangster Oni Madden. And George Raft introduced him to the entire Hollywood crowd. And Bugsy Siegel had these tremendous parties of Hollywood movie stars and directors and producers, and he would borrow money from them and never pay them back. And they felt that they had to lend him the money because he was such a dangerous character. If they didn't lend him the money, they might be killed. And Bugsy bragged in a conversation with Meyer Lansky that he had borrowed over $400,000 from these people and never paid them a penny back. And they never asked him for the money. They were frightened of asking him to pay back the money. And he took over control of prostitution, small gambling operations in and around Los Angeles. And then he took control of the extras union. And he used that as a way to further extort money from the movie studios. That if they needed 100 extras on a set, they better, meet his demands, or the extras would go on strike, and that would put an end to the production of a movie, and that would cost the studios millions and millions of dollars. So he was able to do that, and he used as his bagman to do this Mickey Cohen, who was sort of Siegel's protege. And while Bugsy Siegel was a very handsome and very charming, a very well-dressed man who could associate socially with all these people, Mickey Cohen was a real thug and had the manners of a thug. And so if Bugsy sent him around to see someone who was a little recalcitrant about paying off. Mickey Cohen could easily threaten them with just a few words, and they would cave in immediately and give them exactly what they wanted. And when Bugsy was finally killed, Mickey Cohen was bereft. He felt terrible. He went into a hotel in Los Angeles and started shooting up at the ceiling, saying, "Whoever shot Bugsy Siegel, he better come down right now because I'm going to blow his brains out." And no one came down, so Mickey Cohen just had to leave with his gun still smoking. But Mickey Cohen was quite a character. He started out as a pre-adolescent gangster when he was 9 years old, and he was a very short little guy. When he was 9 years old, he went with a baseball bat and two other guys, and they held up a major movie theater in Los Angeles by threatening the ticket taker with the bat. And he and his pals walked away with whatever money they had in the movie theater. But he was only 9 years old when he did this. He was a total menace on the street. And then he moved back to Chicago and was a boxer for a while. And did pretty well, but he killed a guy in Chicago in a restaurant over nothing, just over an argument. And the outfit thought he was too hot to stay there, so they sent him back to Los Angeles, which is where he started working for Bugsy Siegel. And the first time he went to meet Bugsy Siegel, but Bugsy used to work out at the local YMCA every day, and he used to take sun lamp treatments and massages. He was a real narcissist, and Mickey Cohen was sent there to meet him, his first meeting, and he couldn't believe that this guy was really a gangster. He seemed more like a Hollywood hairdresser than a gangster. And finally, Bugsy Siegel had to tell him that if he didn't mind his manners, he would shoot him. And George Raft was sent by Bugsy Siegel to reemphasize this to Mickey Cohen, and he brought in Mickey Cohen as a subordinate partner to also control Jack Dragna and Dragna's mafia family, which was known as a Mickey Mouse mafia because it was so small and inept. And Jack Dragna hated both Mickey Cohen and Bugsy Siegel, but he was very frightened of going up against Bugsy Siegel because he knew that if he did, the New York mobsters would send some assassins to kill him. And he waited until after Bugsy Siegel was killed before he decided to go to war with Mickey Cohen. And he tried to use Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano as his emissary to get Cohen on a few occasions, and it never worked out. I mean, Cohen seemed to be made of Teflon. No matter how many times they tried to kill him, they always seemed to miss, and they must have tried a dozen times. He owned a restaurant and also a men's clothing store on Sunset Boulevard, and he was a germaphobe, so he was always in the bathroom washing his hands. And Jack Dragna had sent a gang into the restaurant to assassinate Mickey Cohen, and just before they arrived, Mickey Cohen went into the bathroom to wash his hands, and he and his gang and Jack Dragna's gang kind of shot it out in the restaurant and on the street outside the restaurant. And when Mickey Cohen heard the shooting, he just went out the back door of the restaurant and went home. So see, he avoided being killed. And another time, Jack Dragna put a bomb under the bedroom of Mickey Cohen's house. However, Mickey Cohen and his wife, who normally slept in separate bedrooms, that night Mickey Cohen decided to sleep with his wife, which was on the other side of the house. So the bomb went off and blew up Mickey Cohen's bedroom. And Mickey Cohen shortly thereafter ran out onto the street in his pajamas asking what the hell's going on here. And half of his house had been demolished, but he was fine.
He was the original Teflon Don, wasn't he?
He really was. And it was extraordinary that they constantly missed him. And I know there was a gangster who worked for him. I can't remember his name right now. And Jack Dragna tried to recruit him into his gang. And they invited him to a meeting, and they said, we want you to join us and leave Mickey Cohen. He said, I'm not going to. So Jimmy Fratiano and another gangster came out from a closet, and they strangled this guy and killed him. And they sent a message to Mickey Cohen about what had happened. And Cohen's reply was, well, we're just going to kill some more of your people, if you keep trying to kill my people. And this war went on and on and on all the time.
So
but
after Bugsy Siegel was killed, he's killed probably because they suspected him of shenanigans with the money that they were pouring into the Flamingo. I believe, wasn't it the Flamingo?
Yes.
And then he's killed, and then Mickey Cohen's still there. So what happens after that? How's that transition of power work?
Well, Mickey Cohen took over the rackets, and he also took over the extorting of the movie studios. But in addition to that, he also went into some new ventures. So he started secretly filming movie actresses who were having extramarital affairs, and then blackmailing them to suppress the films. And he and a man named Hank Sanacola, who was Frank Sinatra's manager, started a kind of like newspaper, a gossipy newspaper called Hollywood Nightlife. And they would extort movie stars and directors, saying that if you didn't take out a full-page ad, which was extremely pricey, that we were going to publish these stories about you. And even though Hank Sanacola was Frank Sinatra's manager, they even managed to extort Frank Sinatra about having an affair with Ava Gardner while he was married to his first wife, Nancy Sinatra. So they made a fortune doing this. One of the people they extorted was Robert Mitchum about his contact with hookers. And they extorted everyone that they could. And Mickey Cohen used a gangster named Johnny Stompanato, who was killed by Lana Turner. However, Lana Turner and her lawyer were able to get Lana's daughter to take the blame for the murder. I think her name was Cheryl Crane.
I think so. Most people think that the daughter did it today. I would have said, the daughter did it, but Lana did it, and they got the daughter to take the rap because she's a juvenile. Huh.
Exactly. And so, the daughter said that Johnny Stompanato was running at her in the doorway, and she had a knife in her hand, and the knife just accidentally went into his stomach, and that's how he died. However, when the medical examiner came, they saw that the sheet on Lana Turner's bed was covered with blood. So how did all that blood get onto the sheet if he was stabbed, in the doorway of the bedroom? And he was stabbed multiple times in the back. So the medical examiner said it looked like he was stabbed while he was sleeping.
Yeah.
And so Mickey Cohen had all these love letters that Lana Turner had written to Johnny Stompanato, and Mickey Cohen loved Johnny Stompanato. He treated him like a son, and he was indignant that Lana Turner got away with the murder rap, and so he started publishing the letters and printing them, but no one paid any attention to them, and he even threatened to kill Lana Turner, but nothing ever came of that.
Interesting. He is an interesting guy. Another thing I want to ask about Mickey Cohen, and did he say I'm a Jew first and a mobster second when he was raising money for Israel? Because this was the 1950s. Israel became a state in 1948, and they needed guns because they had all these Arabs were coming down on them. So tell us a little bit about Mickey Cohen and I'm a Jew first and a mobster second.
Yeah, he was very, very pro-Israel. He was an ardent Zionist, and he would hold these fundraising events to raise money of Israel, and he would invite gangsters, not only from Los Angeles but from Arizona, from Phoenix, from Texas, all over the Southwest to these shindigs, and And he would ask people to stand up and announce how much money they were going to give. And if it wasn't enough money, he walked over to the guy and he grabbed him by his forearm or his upper arm, and he would say, "I think you can do a lot better than that, can't you?" And he would get them to double the money. And Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano was at one of these, and he pledged to give $25,000 to Israel, but he never came through with the money. And so Mickey Cohen had to pay him a personal visit. And with a gun to his head, he said, "You owe us $25,000, and we don't want it, and we don't want a check. We want cash."
So it sounds like Fradiano kind of was playing both sides during this time. He of course, he was Sicilian or Italian, and he was with Dragna at one point in time, but now all of a sudden he's with Cohen, or he's at least, not actively trying to kill him all the time.
But yeah, Fradiano was all over the place. I mean, for a brief period after, I think it was after Jack Dragna's death, he was put in charge of the Dragna family. He was the interim boss of it for a while. And then the outfit demoted him and made him a soldier again. And he was very angry about that. And then I don't know if in the 1970s, there's a famous photograph of Frank Sinatra with members of the Gambino crime family that was taken at the Westchester Premier Theater in New York. It was a theater that was run by the mob, and it was driven into bankruptcy by the mob. And there he is, Jimmy Fradiano is there in that photograph with the New York mobsters. So, he was like this character who seemed to pop up wherever the mob was. And eventually he admitted to 5 murders, though they think he actually committed 11. He testified against the mob and went into the witness protection program. And they eventually kicked him out of the program, and he decided to become a writer. And he wrote a book with another writer, I think his name was Ovid Damaris, called The Last Mafioso. Yeah. And then one other, and then he eventually developed Alzheimer's and died. But he was the kind of guy who he was very opportunistic, and wherever he could make a buck, that's where he was. So there, he was with Jack Dragna for a while. He was with Mickey Cohen for a while. He was with the Gambino crime family. He was with the outfit. He went to Arizona for a while. He seemed to be all over the map.
Yeah, he was involved in a murder in Cleveland too, getting them some explosives, I think. But anyhow, that guy he was something else. So he is a product of Tinseltown, shall we say?
Yes, absolutely.
Mickey Cohen was maybe one of the most famous mobsters because of movies and television out of Tinseltown, and he was involved in extorting from the movie industry. But the outfit moves out there about this time.
Right. I just wanted to mention that when I was growing up in the 1950s, there used to be an interview show on one of the local TV shows, and it was run by a man named Alexander King, and he frequently had Mickey Cohen on as a guest.
Oh, right.
And he would appear with a woman who was a real classical kind of Hollywood bimbo, with the big blonde hair and the low cut gown. And this is in the middle of the afternoon, and she looks like she's dressed for New Year's Eve. And Mickey Cohen was there, and his feet could barely touch the floor when he was sitting on the chair. He was such a little guy. And it was funny to watch these two together being interviewed. And he said on one of these shows, he said, "I never killed anybody who didn't deserve to be killed."
Man, that guy he was a piece of work, wasn't he? You understand why he became almost like a household name. When I was a kid, I remember the name Mickey Cohen. He said gangster, to me, he said gangster. I don't remember Bugsy Siegel. I don't remember any of those New York mobsters, but I remember Mickey Cohen.
Yeah, he was a publicity hound also. He loved being interviewed, and he loved being on television. And the other thing is that he teamed up for a while with the evangelist Billy Graham, and they were going to do evangelist shows together. And at one point, I think Mickey Cohen was using Billy Graham to kind of whitewash his reputation, and he promised Billy Graham that he would convert to being a fundamentalist Protestant, and at the last moment backed out. But Billy Graham continued to hope that Mickey Cohen would embrace Jesus Christ sometime in his life.
Wow, I've never heard that one before. I did notice that in your book when I was going through, and I've gotten my notes here to ask you about that. Man, I tell you what, he was a precursor to these modern day Michael Franchise, who converted to Christianity, and Bobby Luisi, and then has a TV show, an internet show, a YouTube show, and Sammy the Bull. They're all giving interviews and all that. This guy was a start of it all.
Yeah. It was amazing how that attracted a large number of people and convinced a large number of people that he had really reformed and he was no longer a gangster. And you have to wonder how many of these others who did the same thing, how sincere they really are.
Yeah, really. Well, they haven't got caught at anything yet,
Right.
But we'll see. So the outfit moves out. They've moved into Las Vegas right after Bugsy Siegel was killed, and all of a sudden Dave Berman and let's see, Gus Greenbaum. You know more about this than I do from your book about the rise and fall of the mob in Vegas. They move into the Vegas scene, and Chicago seems to start heading west at this point in time. They've already got Johnny Rosselli out there. He's kind of in and around the scene. So what happens then? And we have in the late 40s or middle to late 40s, we had the Hollywood extortions, which so many of them fell on. Now, that's kind of was, like kind of dovetailed in with Cohen's control of the extras union. They moved in on, I believe, another one of the unions. I don't remember which one, was stagehands or somebody, but
it was the stagehands, and basically they started doing it in Chicago. Willie Bioff and a man named Brown started doing it, and they were so successful at it that the outfit sent them to Los Angeles because the pickings were so much greater out there, and they immediately went after one union after another, and they gained control of several unions that dealt with the stagehands, the carpenters. They also had the Teamsters who delivered all the props and everything. So they were really controlling just about all the unions, and they were reaping a whirlwind of money for the mob. It was extraordinary, and they used Rosselli as sort of their bagman and an ambassador, because while Willie Bioff was just as crude and as coarse as Mickey Cohen, Johnny Rosselli was more in the mode of Bugsy Siegel. He was a very good-looking guy. He dressed expensively. He knew a lot of the movie people and could be charming with them. And he would go around as Willie Bioff's bagman, and he would collect the money, and then they would send it to Chicago. But Willie Bioff almost got killed because they discovered that he was skimming some of this money for himself. Mm-hmm. And they gave him an ultimatum that he had to pay it back or else, and he did. But Willie Bioff was really a very, very bad person. I mean, there was nothing redeeming about him. This man was just a horrible human being. And one of the big movie studios that was really in debt to the mob, not only the outfit, but also mobsters in New York and New Jersey, was Harry Cohn, who was the president of Columbia Pictures. The mob had invested a lot of money in Columbia Pictures, helped to finance a lot of movies. And so, for example, the mobster who was known as the Al Capone of New Jersey, a man named Longy Zwillman, had given $500,000 to Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures. And Harry Cohn offered to sign an IOU for it. And Zwillman said, no, I want $500,000 worth of Columbia Pictures stock. And he got that. And Zwillman was the lover of Jean Harlow. And he went to Harry Cohn. He said, I want her to star in this movie, this movie, this movie, and this movie. And Harry Cohn had no choice but to do that. And when Frank Sinatra wanted his part in From Here to Eternity, his godfather in New Jersey was a partner of Longy Zwillman named Willie Moretti. And Willie Moretti was the cousin of Frank Costello in New York. And so Frank Costello had also invested a lot of money in Columbia Pictures, and Willie asked Frank Costello to call Harry Cohn and ask him to give Frank Sinatra the part in the movie. And Costello did that, and that's how Frank Sinatra got the part. It wasn't like in The Godfather where a horse's head was cut off or anything like that. It was fairly straight. It was just returning a favor for a favor, basically.
Interesting. I tell you what, that it's like somehow it's almost like this is a small town. People are connected to each other, they're related to each other, and then it's throughout the whole United States. So you've got this web of connections all over the whole United States that people sometimes are even cousins.
I know. and what was interesting though also is when Albert Anastasia wanted to take over Frank Costello's mob, he didn't want to do it because Willie Moretti had so many soldiers in his mob that could have killed Albert Anastasia. So they waited until Willie Moretti was assassinated, and then they moved in on Frank Costello because they felt that Willie Moretti, who would have protected him, had been removed. And that's when Frank Costello retired, and actually it was Vito Genovese who came in and took control of what had originally been the Lucky Luciano mob. But what was also interesting about this guy, Harry Cohn, who was president of Columbia Pictures, is he was the inventor of the casting couch. Virtually any woman who starred in a movie at Columbia Pictures had to sleep with Harry Cohn. And if they didn't, they didn't get the job. And one of the stars that he brought along and was making into a major motion picture star during the time when you had all these beautiful blonde women like Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield and others, Diana Dors, was Kim Novak. And he put a lot of time and effort into molding her into being a big star. Well, she was going out with Sammy Davis Jr. at the time. And this was a no for in the 1950s for a white woman to be going out with a black man. And it would have killed the distribution of her movies in the South if this became known. So Harry Cohn had Mickey Cohen go see Sammy Davis Jr. and tell him that he had to break up with Kim Novak or else. And Sammy wouldn't do it. So Harry Cohn issued a contract on the life of Sammy Davis. And once again, he sent Mickey Cohen out to speak to Davis. And Davis said, you have 48 hours to marry a black woman and never see Kim Novak again. And to reinforce this, he sent out 2 additional gangsters whose names I don't remember. They were soldiers in the Dragnet gang. And they said to Sammy Davis Jr., look, you're a one-eyed black Jew. And if you don't give up Kim Novak tomorrow, you're going to be a blind black Jew. And Sammy Davis was terrified. And he called Sam Giancana in Chicago because he and Sinatra and Dean Martin were all friends of Giancana and had done work for Giancana. And Giancana said, well, I have no control over what's going on in Hollywood. If it was Chicago or even Las Vegas, I might be able to help you, but I can't here. And so Sammy Davis broke up with Kim Novak and he married a black woman who was a singer in a Las Vegas casino. He paid her $25,000, gave her $10,000 for a clothing allowance. They stayed married for a few months and then divorced. But what was amazing is the extent that Harry Cohn would go to get his way. And when he was hated by everyone at Columbia Pictures who worked for him, he was a miserable boss. And when he died, they had a big funeral for him at the Columbia Studios, and 2,000 people showed up. And a reporter said to the comedian Red Skelton, he said, why do you think so many people showed up for Harry Cohn's funeral? And Red Skelton said, when you give people what they want, they'll come. In other words, I was so happy to see this guy dead.
Yeah.
And when they asked the rabbi who performed the funeral service for Harry Cohn, if there's one word that you would use to describe Harry Cohn, what would you say? And you said, he's dead. That's the best thing you can say about him.
Wow, it's amazing how much the mob preyed on Hollywood and the movie business. It just, I mean, we've just scratched the surface on how much they preyed on them. It just,
Yeah, and the guy who portrayed the Frank Sinatra character in The Godfather, I think his name was Al Martino.
yeah, Al Martino.
The director wanted to give that part to Vic Damone, but Al Martino was in with the Buffalino family, and Buffalino went and said, "No, you're going to keep Al Martino in that part or else," and so he stayed in the movie too.
Yeah, there's a more modern example of the mob influence in the film industry is right there. They did a whole film about that, and it's pretty entertaining. I just did a little short thing about the real Luca Brasi. He was really used to be a professional wrestler, and he was really an enforcer and a leg breaker for the Colombo family. And this Al Ruddy, the director, saw him on set and said, "Hey, we need to get that guy in the movie."
Well, when Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, he used a lot of real gangsters in that movie as extras, including one of the two mafia cops, Lou Esposito.
Yeah, I remember I saw a little deal on YouTube, and then I kind of looked it up where he's one of them sitting there when they pan the camera past all the people sitting in the Copacabana, that he's one of the mobsters. So,
right.
Anyhow, so you got anything else kind of interesting about this that people maybe didn't know? That
Johnny Roselli was also an interesting character, and he finally got his uppance, so to speak. He and an entrepreneur started cheating members at the Friars Club in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
In a card game. They had put a camera in the ceiling, and they had a guy up there with the camera who was telling them the cards that people were holding at these very high stakes poker game, and where people would lose $100,000 in a night. And Johnny Roselli was in for 25% of the take. And the FBI finally closed it down, and Roselli wound up going to prison for that. And one of the way, and he was worried about being deported back to Italy. And one of the ways that he got out of being deported back to Italy is he went to work for the CIA. He and Sam Giancana were working for the CIA when they were trying to assassinate Castro, and he was called twice to testify at Senate hearings. The first one was about the CIA's involvement in trying to assassinate Castro, and the second one was a committee dealing with the assassination of President Kennedy. And before he went to that, he was assassinated. Johnny Roselli was killed by the Chicago mob while he was out on a fishing boat off the coast of Florida, and they couldn't fit his body into an oil drum, so they cut off his legs and his arms and stuffed his body with his limbs in there, and they had drilled holes in the tank so that it would sink, so air wouldn't form in it, but gases formed in his abdomen, and it caused the oil can to float to the surface, and it was found by two fishermen, and that's how they discovered Johnny Roselli's body. And it was around the same time that Sam Giancana was also assassinated, because he was also called to testify before the same assassination committee about whether the mob was involved in the killing of John Kennedy.
Interesting. Now, Johnny Roselli didn't he even produce a picture, or he had something, he really had some hands-on experience in that, and married some kind of a minor movie star too. Right.
So he after he served a term in prison, before he served a term in prison, he was very good friends with Harry Cohn, and they each wore a friendship ring that the other had given to him. And when Johnny Roselli got out of prison, he went to see Harry Cohn about getting a job, and Harry Cohn said, "I can't give you a job because I'm not allowed to hire any ex-convicts, any felons." And they had a tremendous falling out where Roselli cursed and yelled at Harry Cohn, who he thought was his best friend. And he was friends with, what was his name? Eddie Foy, who was, there had been a group of actors and vaudeville people, and I think it was Eddie Foy and the Seven Little Foys, and
that.
Eddie Foy Jr. Was the son, and he was I'm sorry, it was Brian Foy. Brian Foy was the son. I just looked it up in the index. Eddie Foy was the father. Brian Foy was the youngest son, and he became a movie producer. And he was a good friend of Johnny Roselli. And he brought Johnny Roselli in to help him produce movies. And they produced 3 movies together, kind of film noir classics that won a tremendous number of awards. But for some reason, Johnny Roselli wasn't satisfied doing that, even though he was becoming very successful as a movie producer. He it's as if he had to be involved in something that was illegal in order to make himself happy. Being a producer just wasn't going to do it for him.
Yes, I have known guys like that. I asked one of them, I said, dude, you're smart. You've got organizational skills. You got enthusiasm and energy. Why don't you put that into some kind of a regular business? I said, that's no fun.
Exactly. I mean, that's what these guys were like. If there wasn't some way to scam someone and do something illegal, their lives were just boring. It didn't matter how much money they were making from some legal operation that they owned. It just wasn't good enough for them.
Yeah. It's a crazy life, and I tell you that those Hollywood producers, they made a lot of money, and they were like fat hogs for the slaughtering, or fat geese for the picking.
Yeah. One of the other things that I wrote about, I wrote about Robert Evans, who was one of the top Hollywood producers of all times. He produced the Godfather movies, he produced Marathon Man, he produced Love Story. But he was a cocaine addict, and he was a protege of Sidney Korshak, who the FBI said was the most powerful lawyer in America, who really worked for the outfit in Chicago. And when Robert Evans was getting divorced from his wife, who then married Steve McQueen wanted to adopt Robert Evans's son and change his surname from Evans to McQueen. And Evans was furious about this. And he went to Sidney Korshak, and Korshak went to Steve McQueen and said, you do this and we're going to kill you. And that's how he never changed the name from McQueen to Evans. And
Steve McQueen.
Right. And apparently Steve McQueen was quaking in his boots. I mean, he was terrified. And he went back to Sidney Korshak and he said, everything's going to be all right. Please don't harm me. Please, I beg you, don't hurt me.
I hate to
which is so different than his movie image. He wasn't quite the tough guy that he appeared to be in the movies.
Yeah, the cool, collected guy that wasn't afraid of anybody. That was Ali McGraw.
Yes, Ali McGraw.
An affair with on I know a lot about Steve McQueen on the set of The Getaway, I believe, and Robert Evans supposedly figured this out and drove out into the desert wherever they were doing this and caught them together in some kind of
but because Robert Evans was a cocaine addict, he was fired from his jobs and he couldn't get any more funding for movies, and he wanted to produce this movie called The Cotton Club, and he got involved with cocaine dealers and cocaine gangsters, and a couple of people got murdered. His co-producer, a guy named Roy Radin, was killed by a woman who wanted to be a producer, and they kicked her out, and she wound up hiring 2 thugs to kill Roy Radin because he wouldn't give her back her money, and she wound up going to prison for life. And Sidney Korshak was able to keep Robert Evans out of this. Robert Evans just walked away as if nothing ever happened to him, and he was able to finish producing the movie, though they took the movie away from him and he didn't make any money from it. But it was extraordinary, the power that Sidney Korshak had because of his representation of the mob, and yet they kept that away from the general public, because Korshak also represented a number of Fortune 500 companies. And when he was insulted by the woman who owned, I forgot the name of the large racetrack in Los Angeles, he called for a strike on the racetrack and closed it down for a week until the woman apologized to him. And in 1968, Warren Beatty was at the Democratic convention in Chicago and couldn't get a hotel room. And he went into the phone booth. I think it was of the Drake Hotel or the Ambassador East, one of those two hotels. And he called Sidney Korshak and he asked him if he could help him get a hotel room. And he asked Warren what hotel he was calling from. And he said, "Hold on, I'll be back to you in 5 minutes." And he called and he got back on the phone 5 minutes later. And he said, "You can have any one of 3 suites that I've arranged for you in the hotel." I mean, that's how powerful he was. Wow. And he could get people's children into Ivy League colleges with a phone call. He could get them a full scholarship with a phone call. He could close down the Los Angeles Dodgers for a day if he wanted to. His power was just extraordinary. And he never tried a case in California. And he wasn't even licensed to practice law in California. He was licensed to practice law in Chicago. And he would throw a Christmas Eve party every year, and all the great luminaries of Hollywood were invited to it. And if someone wasn't invited to it, they refused to admit it. They would say, "Well, I had to go into the hospital that day for surgery, or I was out of the country that day, and that's why I couldn't attend," because no one wanted to admit that they hadn't been invited to a Sidney Korshak Christmas Eve party.
Wow, he was the guy that bridged that gap, that greased all the wheels between the mob, whether it be back east or Chicago, primarily Chicago, and the film industry, wasn't he?
Yeah. So, there was one incident I wanted to tell you that when Willie Bioff was extorting the movie studios, each one had to pay him $25,000. I think it was a month or every few months. And he went to Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures and he said, "I want $25,000 from you." And Harry Cohn said, "I'm not going to pay you." And Harry Cohn then called Johnny Roselli, who was still his friend. And Roselli called back to the bosses in Chicago. And the bosses said, "Harry doesn't have to pay anything. He's one of us. And you tell that to Willie and tell Willie to leave him alone or else. And also tell Willie that he has to go and apologize to Harry Cohn." And Willie, who was this really nasty guy, went to apologize to Harry Cohn. And Harry Cohn just said, "Get the hell out of my office. I'm not interested." and Willie Cohn kind of left like a dog with his tail between his legs, which was so unusual for a man who was so nasty and tough as Willie Bioff was. And Willie Bioff, he testified against the outfit during the trial that also sent Paul Ricca and Frank Nitti committed suicide, but sent Paul Ricca and others to prison. He testified secretly to the FBI, and he served a much shorter term than the others did, but they learned about it afterwards. And Willie Bioff moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where he changed his name to Willie Nelson, the same as the singer, and became a good friend of Barry Goldwater, and went into business with Barry Goldwater's nephew. But he was a compulsive gambler, and he would go to Las Vegas, even though he was hiding out in Phoenix under an assumed name. He foolishly went to Las Vegas to gamble, and there he was recognized by members of the outfit, and they reported back to him, to the bosses. And one day, Willie Bioff got into his pickup truck and turned the ignition key and blew himself into 1,000 pieces. But oddly enough, one of the pallbearers at his funeral was Senator Barry Goldwater.
Interesting. I'll tell you what, you just went across this whole span of politicians, legitimate businessmen, lawyers, the film industry, and the upper echelons of the mobs, both East Coast and Chicago and Los Angeles. It's wild, isn't it?
It was fascinating to me. And the thing that got me going across all of this initially was Bugsy Siegel, because Bugsy Siegel started out with the New York mob, and then he went to Los Angeles, and then he went to Las Vegas. And so when I wrote about him in Big Apple Gangsters, I learned more about him in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. And then when I wrote about him in the Las Vegas book, I learned more about him in Los Angeles. So he was sort of a thread that ran through all these different areas.
And like you said, you described him. He was the kind of guy who didn't appear as a gangster. He didn't
Right.
present, as we call it today, as a gangster, and he was smooth and attractive. And it would be hard to believe that he was a gangster until he
That's right.
was.
There were pictures of him at parties with Cary Grant, with others, and he also used to throw these parties where all the famous movie stars would go. And it was interesting because Jimmy Stewart turned him down and said he wouldn't go to a Bugsy Siegel party because Bugsy Siegel was nothing but a gangster, and he didn't want anything to do with him. And when Bugsy Siegel heard this, he confronted Jimmy Stewart, and Bugsy was with George Raft at the time, and Jimmy Stewart said, anytime you want to make something out of this, I'll step outside with you. And George Raft said to Jimmy Stewart, he said, you don't want to step outside with Bugsy Siegel because it'll be the last time you'll ever step outside any place. He said, I would just forget it if I were you. And that was the end of it.
Ah, interesting. Well, Jimmy Stewart, he was a guy, he went into the World War II as a bomber pilot in World War II, one of the most dangerous jobs you could have over there too.
Yeah, he was a pretty brave guy. He flew these bombing missions over Germany during World War II in the 8th Air Force.
Yeah, it was at a high casualty rate, and those guys all knew it. Well, Jeffrey Sussman, this has been great. This is a heck of a book, guys. You got to get this book, Tinseltown Gangsters and Big Apple Gangsters, and the rise and fall of the mafia in Las Vegas. I mean, you get the whole country from one end to the other with these 3 books here.
Thank you very much, Gary.
All right. Well, good to have you on again. Good to see you again, Jeffrey. Haven't seen you for a while, but
I know.
Are you working on anything now? What are you working on now?
Yes, I am. I'm working on a book called Backbeat Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Rock Music.
Ah, that's a good one. I just was talking about that on a show the other day. The Morris Levy and that Roulette Records and that whole thing.
I have a whole chapter about him.
Oh my God, that guy
he was a monster.
He was a mobster that started a record company. He truly was a mobster, and he ripped off everybody.
Yeah,
and artists,
He partnered with what's his name from the Genovese crime family.
Oh yeah, Gigante.
Yeah, Gigante.
Carmine Gigante. Yeah, he did. That's what I was looking into was Gigante and reading up on Morris Levy. So great stuff, Jeffrey. Thanks a lot for coming on. And
My pleasure.
Once again, guys, click on that link and see Jeffrey's books on Amazon. So thanks a lot, guys. Don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles when you're out there on the street, so watch out for motorcycles. If you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline number. And hand in hand with PTSD is drugs and alcohol addiction. And whether you've been in the service or not, former Gambino soldier Anthony Ruggiano has a hotline number on his website, and he is a drug and alcohol counselor down in Florida. So you could have a real deal Bob guy be your drug and alcohol counselor if you wanted to do that. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this with your friends and on your social media pages and all those kinds of things. And just remember, guys, I really appreciate y'all listening in. Thanks a lot.